Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. In today's episode, I'm talking to Professor Catriona McKinnon, a political philosopher based at the University of Exeter. The topic is the various environmental crises facing humanity today. Obviously lots to discuss there, but Catriona wants to highlight one issue in particular, which is the way one generation can, potentially without knowing it, conceal information from future generations about the depth and nature of an environmental crisis. This is an issue of intergenerational justice, and it's one that Catriona thinks deserves more attention. Catriona, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So to begin with, I wondered if you could just set the scene for us by just giving a bit of background on, well, people will be familiar with these, I suppose, but the environmental crises facing humanity as you see them.
Where do you start? So, the climate crisis, I guess, is the one that everybody knows most about, which, as far as I can see, is accelerating and was accelerating before the ascendancy of Trump, but that has the potential to make things much, much worse. Far worse, I think, than many people realise, with climate tipping points and the way in which they might accelerate climate change beyond human control. The biodiversity crisis, so we're in what a lot of ecologists now are happily calling we're at the beginning of the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth. So we've lost 70% of animal populations since 1970, 85% of our wetlands globally, the oceans are polluted. I think that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are very closely coupled and are accelerators of one another. So really you can't address one without addressing the other, but the biodiversity crisis, I think, is very much still the poor cousin of the climate crisis, insofar as it's not in public imagination, and certainly not at the forefront of political action, I think, in the way that climate is. And then plastics pollution, which again, that's bound up with the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And that seems to worsen year by year. And all the kind of more sort of standard forms of pollution, air pollution, waterways. I think the most recent reporting has it that in this country, there are no healthy or unpolluted rivers left at all. I'm sure I'm leaving some out, but that's enough to get us going.
That's enough to be going on with. Yeah. So quite a depressing list of issues there, I suppose. And I suppose like the way people will tend to kind of think of those is in terms of, these are crises which demand action, right?
Yeah.
So obviously people will differ in their opinion on what exactly one should be doing about these things, but they are urgent situations and they're things that we need to be addressing. But we're particularly going to be talking about the ethics of these issues, right? So we're not going to be talking about the kind of practical concerns about how to address the crises. We're more interested here for the purposes of this conversation with the way those crises raise ethical issues. There are all sorts of ways in which those crises raise ethical issues, and philosophers of ethics have often been interested in the way these crises and our responses to them raise questions of justice, right?
Yeah.
So would you be able to, again, just set the scene a bit by telling us a bit about what those issues of justice are that have interested philosophers in the past?
Yeah, so I think most sort of fundamentally and obviously the way that we're trashing the planet is going to it's already visiting great injustice on people in the most climate vulnerable parts of the world who are suffering droughts, famines, losses of livelihood, loss of homeland, loss of culture. There's evidence connecting the climate crisis to increased levels of violence and violent conflict in various parts of the world. So, at the most fundamental level, if we're trashing our life support system, that's tantamount to visiting injustice on all those who are at the sharp end of that trashing.
Yeah.
I mean, in particular, my particular interest has been in intergenerational injustices. So the way in which what we in the present are doing, the sort of full brunt of that in terms of its impacts will not be felt in our own lifetimes. So we are doing things which will create potentially a hell on earth for people in the future. And violate their rights in exactly the same way as those of the rights of climate vulnerable people in the present. I mean, I would say to that as well, I think there are also really, really important questions about, the value of the sort of intrinsic value of the environment and the justice that we might owe to species, and the extent to which ecosystems and natural systems have sort of freestanding independent moral status and might even be assigned rights in themselves. I think those are all really, really important, and not excluded by the kind of focus on people that my work has tended to have.
Sure. Yeah. I can see that. Yeah. So there are these debates, aren't there, about whether the value that the environment has is just dependent on its kind of utility to people or its potential impact on people, or whether we ought to think about whether that's a kind of unreasonably anthropocentric version of ethics, and we should be thinking more about the intrinsic value of environmental phenomena. But just to kind of summarize what you were saying about justice there, I suppose one way of thinking about this is that there are justice issues when the people or groups that contribute to something like an environmental crisis and the people who are impacted by those crises, there's a kind of mismatch between those two groups, right? So where the people who are contributing least are quite often the people who are impacted most, and that can happen in a geographical way. So you might think about kind of people in the global south whose kind of activities are contributing relatively little to environmental crises, but then likely to be disproportionately affected by those crises. And actually, listeners might want to go back to one of our previous recordings where I interviewed somebody called Munamato Chemhuru, who's a philosopher from Zimbabwe, and he was talking also about the way African voices are excluded from the conversation about environmental crises as well, and that's another kind of injustice, right? That they're also being ignored and sidelined in those discussions. But what you're thinking about at the moment is not the kind of geographical distribution, it's more a distribution over time, right? And questions about the way people in one era might be contributing to a crisis which disproportionately affects people in a future era. So there's that kind of injustice as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about inequalities of power. I think fundamentally, the both in the intra-generational sense and the sort of geographical sense, but also the intergenerational sense. What enables these injustices to be visited on certain groups by other groups is great inequalities of power and the histories of those inequalities of power, whether that's to do with it always is to do with resources, isn't it? But it's all about power and vulnerability and the way in which these things are not equally distributed across time and across space. But my current I suppose, at the moment, and most of the work I've done in the past actually has been primarily focused on the temporal sort of dimension here, and the way in which, if you think about it, right, the time's arrow goes in one direction, meaning that there really is a sort of fundamental vulnerability of future people to what we do in the present. We can do everything to them and they can do nothing to us. I mean, they can badmouth us, which isn't nothing, but they can't. And certainly as time progresses, the sort of mechanisms for accountability, etc., such as they are, which is not saying much, become even more sort of attenuated. So there is that really fundamental vulnerability that future people have to what we're doing in the present, that I think sort of raises really difficult questions, both of ethics, what the nature of the sort of wrongdoing might be that one generation could do to another, and in particular in the context of environmental crises, and what the mechanisms of that wrongdoing might be. So what sort of enables that? But I think it's really important as well to pull that ethical thinking through to I sort of focus on institutions and institutional structures, and the absence, actually, at all sorts of levels of institutional structures which enable us to deliver justice to future people. Because I think probably most people, if you ask them, would say that they want to do that. They're motivated to do that. Much of our sort of culture and our artistic forms and our ways of life are sort of infused with, I think, a care for the future, but that is not mirrored in our political, economic institutions. So I think making that connection between ethics and institutional change, it can be really powerful and it's really important to do as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the particular kind of injustice you're interested in here, though, is about the concealment of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So the suggestion you're making is that one generation can conceal knowledge about the extent and nature of the degradation of the environment from succeeding generations. So could you tell me a bit about like how might that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to say is this is joint work between me and Stephen Gardner. He's a philosopher at the University of Washington. He's written a lot on climate ethics and intergenerational ethics as well. So this is very much a sort of joint project between the two of us. So we think that there is at least an overlooked dimension of this inequality of power between present people and those in the future that is really important to make good on, because it could actually be significantly worsening our environmental crises. And our thought here is, so we're sort of bringing together two buckets of things in this work we're doing. One is the sort of general thinking that we were just talking about around intergenerational ethics and justice and the inequalities of power and vulnerability. And both Steve and I have done quite a lot of work in the past to try and unpack that idea in the context of the climate crisis. What's involved in intergenerational wrongdoing in the climate crisis. And the other sort of bucket of stuff that we're bringing to this work comes out of a project that I am co-leading, massive big project here at Exeter, big interdisciplinary project on biodiversity renewal. And so we're working very closely with ecologists in this project. And I've been learning from them about something called shifting baseline syndrome, which there is a sort of increasing amount of evidence for in the conservation literature. And the idea here is, or what the evidence is pointing towards, is the thought that when individuals, groups of people are making judgments about the quality of their natural environments, there is a pattern, a tendency by which they index those judgments to baselines that reflect the actual quality of their natural environments that they find themselves in. So that over time, if we imagine a scenario, say, of environmental degradation, there is the possibility that that becomes, in the worst case, invisible, or at least not as noticeable as it otherwise would be, as subsequent groups of people have judged the quality of their natural environments according to baselines which reflect the actuality of their natural environments. And if those environments are degraded, then they may not be noticing just how bad things are for them in comparison with the past. And there's quite a lot of evidence sort of gathering across all sorts of environmental domains that this is a very widespread phenomenon. And I think we should be really alarmed by that, really alarmed by that. And so Steve and I, talking this through, thinking about it in the context of that gathering environment, of that gathering sort of evidence, empirical evidence in conservation science, and given our concern with the ethics of intergenerational relations and the way in which intergenerational power can be abused, is there a space here for thinking about how a present generation might engage in what we call intergenerational environmental blinding? That is, doing things, whether it's at sort of policy levels or by other mechanisms, which can feed into phenomena like shifting baselines in such a way as to make environmental degradation that generation is responsible for invisible or less noticeable to future generations.
Okay.
So that's the kind of broad space that we're working in. Is this possibility that we think we should take really seriously? We think there are examples from non-environmental domains which are very compelling. We don't think intergenerational ethicists have looked at this at all, and it's really important. And we don't think environmental philosophers have really looked at it. And so we're trying to unpack that idea, and we're trying to put flesh on the bones of that idea, and it's a sort of call to action almost to our colleagues to actually think seriously about this as an overlooked phenomenon that could be of great concern to us, should be of great concern to us.
Okay. I wonder if we could just take that idea of shifting baseline syndrome again next. I'm not sure I've quite got my head around it yet.
Sure, yeah.
Are there some examples, like concrete examples you could give of how this works in practice?
Yeah. So the original term, and it is a horrible phrase, shifting baseline syndrome, but it's kind of stuck. The original term was put forward in a paper by a conservationist called Daniel Pauly in 1995. And what he noticed was he was working with marine scientists who were sort of located at fisheries. And what he noticed is that marine scientists took as their baseline for the sort of quality and abundance of fish stock, how fish stock looked at the beginning of their careers. So that would be their sort of fixed point, and then they would make their judgments about fish stocks based on that particular sort of fixed baseline. Despite the fact that non-scientists, and this raises interesting questions in itself, sort of, fisher folk were telling them, no, actually, the fish stock have declined significantly since my grandfather's time. But the scientists, ignoring that kind of experiential, potentially indigenous knowledge, were discounting that. That wasn't altering their judgments of the reality of what fish stock looked like. So he noticed that in that very kind of restricted domain. And since then, there's been lots of papers looking at forests, looking at the climate crisis, looking at oceans, looking at urban environments and the disappearance of nature from urban environments. There's sort of repeated evidence that this is sort of popping up all over the place. And if you get that iterated across subsequent generations. Another example, which I found really heartbreaking and compelling, was a really fast example, because this can happen quickly. Adjacent generations, I think it was in the Yangtze Basin, the older generation had put, there was great sort of cultural significance for a particular species of dolphin that lived in the river, and they sort of appeared in their stories and their sort of, sense of who they were and mythologies and everything. Subsequent generation, the next generation, just didn't notice when the dolphins had disappeared. They couldn't even identify them as a result of pollution in the Yangtze. So within the space of one generation, you find that this loss has just sort of gone on, it isn't even really registering in the subsequent generation. Because they're looking at a polluted river and that's all they've known. Even for even when the knowledge that's being lost relates to something, a really culturally significant species. So if that's happening around us in a widespread way, it could, it's really not very good news for those of us who care about the state of the planet, right? Things could actually be much worse than we had thought they were if not only the planet, but our knowledge of it is being significantly degraded across time.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I can see how that works now. I was going to ask you kind of how, but why is this happening, and kind of what's motivating it? But it sounds like it's a sort of psychological phenomenon at base, right? It's a kind of very human thing that we kind of tend to think that
Yeah,
things when we arrive, things are normal, and then we kind of
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of track their decline or whatever it is from there. So is it just something that's kind of fairly basic to human psychology? Is it something that
Mm.
yeah how yeah I suppose that there are further questions about what we should do about it, but what do you think at bottom is explaining this?
Yeah, so I think the honest answer is we don't know.
Mm.
That said, one of my colleagues at Exeter, a conservationist, I'll plug my project with him. It's called Renew,
Right.
Renewing Biodiversity Through a People and Nature Approach, and I co-lead this project with Kevin Gaston, who's a well-known conservation scientist, and he does a lot of work on shifting baseline syndromes and
Mm.
is trying to uncover the causes of it.
Mm.
And it's not, in his view, and he's the one who's done the empirical legwork here, not me. In his view, it's not so much. I mean, maybe it's partly just human psychology that we sort of,
Mm.
take what we know to be normal. But he's done a lot of work looking at what's again known in the literature as the extinction of experience.
Mhm.
So this is again a very well documented phenomenon whereby children's experiences of nature, whatever you mean by that, are significantly decreasing in comparison with those of their parents. So they are
Mm.
becoming more and more, and we could talk about what the reasons behind that are, and there are different sort of hypotheses, but it's the kind of direct experiences of the natural world that children are having are, and this is sort of cross-cultural again as well, are much diminished in comparison with those of
Mm.
their parents.
Mm.
If that's happening and children are just becoming less and less sort of, because they're not experiencing it, right? They're becoming
Mm.
less and less aware of, they can't name different species of birds, right? If all birds are
Sure.
just birds to you,
Yeah.
then you're not going to notice the extinction of specific species. So there's a wonderful
Yeah.
quote from Robert Pyle, who was the first to sort of coin this phrase, the extinction of experience. What is the extinction of a condor to a child who hasn't ever seen a wren? Right. And I
Mm.
think what that's getting at is this idea that as your experience contracts, so that can encourage this
Right. Yeah.
phenomenon of shifting baselines. There were other things we
Yeah.
could say as well, but I think that's a very policy relevant domain, actually,
Yeah.
essentially
Yeah.
experience.
It's really interesting. I suppose so first of all, that does sound really plausible as a kind of description of
Mm,
children's experience in different generations. And I suppose various reasons for that were kind of increased urbanization is an obvious
yeah,
one, but
yeah,
also people tending to be a bit more protective of their
that's
children.
right.
Like,
Yeah,
as I'm sure many people would recognize, like, I used to play out on my own a lot more
yeah,
than my children do. And, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that's something that many people will recognize. But the effect of that then is kind of experienced on the level of sort of psychological salience, I suppose. So,
Mm,
yeah, things that would be salient to you if you were more immersed in
yes.
nature are less salient to you, right?
Yeah,
And that has an effect on the way we kind of frame our observations of
yes,
nature. I
absolutely.
suppose that's an interesting observation about science and scientists, right? Because people might be
Mm,
thinking of, well, that kind of thing shouldn't have an effect on science, right? Isn't science just completely objective and, value free and
mm,
so forth? But
indeed.
you do think it has an effect on the way
Well,
scientists
scientists are
frame
human
things.
beings. They live in the same world as everybody else and with the same pressures and the same sort of dynamics and the same
Mm,
sort of intergenerational shifts. So why wouldn't
mm.
it affect the way in which they do their science, right? And
Yeah,
it
yeah.
does, right? I mean, the evidence is that it does. I mean, I think this is a really interesting case, though, just talking about scientists, of a case in which, the conservation science community, or large parts of them at least, not all of them, are sort of see this space of sort of shifting baselines, extinction of experience, as really pressing, really kind of ethically urgent. They're not doing the ethical thinking around that, but they want, they think this is a big gap in sort of conservation efforts, whether that's sort of NGOs or policy level, whatever it is. And so they're kind of crying out for social scientists and humanities and philosophers to pay attention to this and start to sort of theorize it. And I think that's quite an unusual dynamic when you've got the scientists coming to you and saying, we've noticed this thing is happening. We're really worried about it. What might you have to say about this?
Yeah.
And when all you can say back is, oh, I don't think anybody's really noticed that so far. We need to do a bit better, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So what's your ethical analysis of this phenomenon then?
So the first thing to say, I think, is, and this is it might sound a bit pedantic, but it is important. We're not concerned with every case of generational ignorance. We think that there are some, that's just the human condition, right? There's always, every generation doesn't know things about its circumstances. And there's no reason in itself for worry about that. So that is not our claim that, we somehow want generations to be omniscient about, everything. That we're interested in this much more restricted sort of subset of cases whereby one generation behaves in ways that are ethically objectionable and obscures to a subsequent generation or generations facts, knowledge. Doesn't have to just be facts, but knowledge about that generation's circumstances, which are important for it to know. So that's a much more, and there are lots of questions there about what important means and what ethically objectionable means, but we do fill those in. But that's a much more restricted subset than just generational ignorance. So within that subset, we think that, so we identified two kind of buckets of reasons for concern: instrumental reasons and non-instrumental reasons. And the instrumental reasons, I think, are the most straightforward and are also, I think, borne out by some very recent empirical work. So the thought here is that a generation that, let's say, has been blinded to the extent of its country's biodiversity loss. So let's take the UK, right? We're in the bottom 10% globally for biodiversity loss. We're doing really, really badly in the UK. We're not a green and pleasant land. But let's say that, most people are unaware of this because they have, by whatever mechanisms, been blinded to that fact by previous generations. They've had that knowledge obscured from them. That generation is going to be much less well placed to take action to, bend the curve on biodiversity loss. So they are going to be much less inclined and disposed to take action on conservation because they don't think there's a need for it, or they don't think there's as urgent a need for it as there actually is. So this is sort of, if you want a generation, whether it's in degraded circumstances or even if it's in improved circumstances where you want protection for that improvement, they need to know the reality of the quality of their natural environment in order to be motivated and disposed to either preserve it or protect it and make it better. So I think that's quite straightforward. I think that's pretty easy to grasp. And then the non-instrumental reasons are somewhat different. So we think that a generation that has been blinded, let's take the biodiversity loss case again, is in a position where they don't know the true reality of their circumstances. So they're, regardless of what difference that might make to them as in terms of what they do, we think that in itself is a form of harm. Right. So we talk in the paper about Nozick's experience machine, which you'll be familiar with.
Well, I am, but many of my listeners aren't. So we should just explain what that thought experiment
Oh, okay.
is.
Sure. Yeah. So the experience machine, Robert Nozick says, imagine that you were you could be hooked up to this machine by super duper neuroscientists, and they could enable you to have the experience of whatever you might like to have. So writing the great American novel, or visiting the moon, or riding horses freely over the moors, or whatever it is that you love to do, right? And you wouldn't know that that was just a sort of induced experience. So you would just be in the state of sort of belief that you are living the life that you want to live. And he says, would you hook yourself up to this machine, or would it be the right thing for you to do to hook yourself up to this machine? So Steve and I are not, we don't try and answer that question. We're agnostic on it, but rather what we're interested in is the state. If somebody forced you into that machine against your will, right? If somebody hooked you up, what would be wrong with that? Putting aside the issue of consent, right, that you've been forced, what would be wrong with the state that you would be in? And a natural thought, and Nozick expresses this thought, is that you wouldn't be connected with the true reality of your circumstances. He says you wouldn't be, I forget the exact quote, it's in the paper, you wouldn't be living in an active sense, I think he says. And we think that's so that's the experience machine, Nozick's experience machine. We think that's very suggestive and helpful for us in thinking about what would be wrong about what's wrong with intergenerational blinding, putting aside instrumental sort of reasons for concern.
Right.
And what's wrong with it is that you're imposing an epistemic deficit on future generations. You're putting them in a position which compromises their status as knowers of their own worlds.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a form of injustice, we think.
Yes.
We still connect that up with epistemic injustice in the work as well. But we think even if it has no impact on dispositions to take action for conservation of nature, etc., that would still be an injustice to do that to another person, another generation.
I can see that. So I guess like the pop culture version of Nozick's experience machine is The Matrix, right? The film Matrix.
Yeah.
In that film, people are kind of hooked up into this kind of shared virtual reality which they don't know that they're in a simulation, and the real reality is much more bleak. And then characters in the film are kind of become acquainted with that reality. So the thoughts that you're suggesting there is that people who are, there's an injustice in putting people into that kind of simulated reality, even though the kind of quality of their experience would be much more pleasant for them than the alternative, because essentially they would be being deceived, right, about their real circumstances, and there's just something wrong about deceiving people. Is that the thoughts? Yeah.
I mean, we use the word blinded, but deceived is close enough. That even if people who have been blinded would be made are very happy in their blinded state, right? I mean, you can kind of see that actually, given the way the world is and how awful our environmental crises is. I get the temptation that actually wouldn't it be better not to know any of this stuff. So even if they would be happier not knowing, there's still an injustice being done to them. Because justice, we don't think, is indexed to making people happy necessarily.
Yes, good. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So there's that just intrinsic injustice of blinding people to real circumstances. But as you say, coupled with that, there's an instrumental problem, right? In that people who are blinded in that kind of way are less likely to actually take the steps that they need to take to address the situation that they're in. And that's clearly a kind of harm as well. Great. Okay. And then you said that you related these issues to work on epistemic injustice as well.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Yeah.
So this is a kind of secondary. It's an additional sort of place at which we think this phenomenon, the kind of injustice that we're pointing to with blinding, we think there's a gap in the epistemic justice literature around this as well. So the idea of epistemic justice comes from always is most well known through the work of Miranda Fricker, the philosopher Miranda Fricker, and she identifies originally in her big book on this, her first big book on this, two types of epistemic injustice. One she calls testimonial injustice, and this is an injustice which involves the victim being unable to communicate a wrong which has been done to them. So imagine a black person going to the police to complain about racist harassment and not being believed. Why? Well, because let's imagine the police are racist, and we live in a racist society, right? And so there are structures of injustice there and power, which mean that person's experience cannot be communicated effectively. So that's testimonial. There's then what she calls hermeneutical injustice, which is related to a person's inability, because of the structures of power and injustice that surround them, their inability to make sense of injustices that are being done to them.
Yeah.
So the example she gives, I think, is of, sort of a woman in the 1950s in an office environment being subject to sexual harassment, and just having maybe having a sense of unease, but not even being able to sort of conceptualize what's happening to them, why it's an injustice, why they are legitimately, have a legitimate complaint against this.
Yeah.
So there are these two types. We think that environmental intergenerational blinding, when it imposes this sort of non-instrumental damage, we think it is a form of that second type of hermeneutical epistemic injustice.
Yeah.
But not, it's really quite different to the kind that Fricker and others in this literature describe. So they think that this injustice is a product of what they call structural identity prejudice. So people who suffer that kind of epistemic injustice, the woman in the office who suffers sexual harassment, that that injustice is a product of people being members of a particular group who are powerless in a particular society, and towards whom there are all sorts of prejudices embedded into the structures of that society, which prevent that person from understanding their own situation. We think that what we're identifying with blinding in an intergenerational sense is much broader than that. Actually, we don't think it's to do with structural identity prejudices. We don't think it's to do with being a member, beyond being a member of a generation. We don't think it's to do with being a member of a particular group, as a subset of society at large. I mean, this is a bit this might be getting a bit sort of arcane and sort of in the weeds with epistemic justice. But we do think that there is a sort of space here which has been overlooked, and to our knowledge, actually, in this literature, this hasn't been extended at all to the intergenerational domain. So nobody really has spoken about epistemic injustice across generations. It's all been limited to generations. So even opening up that set of questions, I think, is quite important and could be useful for that particular literature as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that really illustrates the nature of the injustice that you're talking about here. I wondered if you'd also given any thought to how this works with regard to responsibility. So, I mean, the way you've described it, it's an institutional kind of structural problem almost, and so there's always difficult questions there about, well, who's responsible for this injustice then? Is that something that you've given attention to as well?
We have, and we do get pushback when we talk about this around sort of, well, what's your view of collective responsibility, and what's your, and I think both Steve and I, well, there's a few things to say here on collective responsibility. I think we don't have a theory of collective responsibility, but we don't think you need one. I think you can point out injustices that are intergenerational in nature. And you can think about those things without having a full-blooded theory of collective responsibility. I mean, you better be able to do that, or much of our thinking around intergenerational justice is in trouble if we can't speak about generations as agents. So that's one thing to say. A second thing to say is that I think we also are fully aware that and say ourselves both together and separately that it's very often subsets of generations who ought to be held responsible for this. So it might be a generational elite. It might be an economic elite, a political elite. So if you look at what's happening in the US at the moment with, the defunding of climate science and the sort of deliberate chilling effect that is having on communication around the nature of the climate crisis and public understanding of that in the US. Who's responsible for that? Well, I'm pretty sure I know who's responsible for that. Yeah. I mean, in separate work, I'll give another plug as well. So this isn't Steve's thing. This is my own work. I'm writing a book at the moment on intergenerational crime in the environmental context, which I call postericide. And so in that book, I try and say, well, there are generational elites and generational subsets who can be held responsible, and we can identify them, and there are mechanisms legally that are ethically defensible by which we can prosecute these people.
Right. Okay.
But that's a separate thing.
Maybe just time for one really quick question then. So I guess the main thing you're trying to do is just bring attention to this phenomenon that you think has been underappreciated and underexamined in the past. But are there any implications for how we ought to, as society or maybe even as individuals, respond to environmental crises in future?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think so. I just mentioned my postericide project, which is covers environmental cases as well. Steve has a project on defending a what he calls a global constitutional convention for future generations as a way of sort of starting to make the sort of institutional change that we need in order to address these problems. I mean, sort of coming down to more policy-facing questions, we've also, again, this is a sort of offshoot of this project, Steve and I have got a paper on biodiversity offsetting. This is the sort of hot new thing for biodiversity policy, whereby the idea is that you aim to achieve no net loss of biodiversity by offsetting biodiversity losses. But the way in which a lot of this offsetting is operating is actually and could actually be, and we think is plausibly should be seen as a site of intergenerational environmental blinding. So I can fill that in. I don't know if we've got time for me to just fill that in quickly for you, or...
Yeah, well, it's I think we've got about a minute to go, but if you want to do that quickly, that's fine with me.
Okay, the quick version. So imagine you've got a developer who wants to build a whole housing development on a plot of land. That would cause, imagine, say, 10% loss of biodiversity.
Yeah.
So the way the policy works in some very common forms of it, not every form, but in some very common forms of it, is that they apply biodiversity offsetting measures, which reduce those losses, let's say, to 5%. So it would have been 10%, but they offset the losses. And so you get 5% losses instead of 10%. That is then communicated and offered up sort of for public and policy success consumption as a 5% biodiversity net gain. When in fact, you've still...
Loss, yeah.
It's a 5% loss, right?
Yeah.
So... And this is a global, so biodiversity offsetting that takes that form is happening everywhere across the world. I mean, it's massively, it's a massive industry which is being built up in a way that is subject to this fundamental, we think, framing, which is misleading and could lead subsequent generations to think that actually they're living in this world in which all these sort of net gains of biodiversity are happening. Combine that with shifting baselines and extinction of experience. And if the reality is you're still getting a decline in biodiversity, then things, we as a generation ought to be thinking about that and do something different, I think.
Yeah. That is all we've got time for. That was fantastic. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, Catriona. Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.